Hi, welcome to the Week 12 Forum. This week our topics are revolution and contention. You probably are at least familiar with the idea of revolution, although you may not be aware of the variety of different kinds of revolutions, uh, but not possibly of theories of explaining why they occurred, and that's really a major part of the chapter. Contention, on the other hand, is probably not a word with which most of you are familiar. And so I'll take a moment to elaborate. First, recognize that there are lots of behaviors that we social scientists group with revolutions, but that are distinct from revolutions. And so think of contention as sort of a catch-all phrase that envelops revolutions and constitutes all the behaviors we tend to think don't rise to the level of seriousness that constitute a revolution. I use the metaphor, politics as a bucket to describe the activities often described as contention in the overview. Scholars like Sidney Tarrow and Charles Tilley they specialize in social movements, which are often moments of contention that might simply involve social advocacy or that may eventually rise to the level of revolutions, displacing one set of political elites with another. One example is Venezuela. If you've been watching what's going on there, you have two rival sets of elites, one headed by Hugo Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, and the other one headed by Juan Guaido, leader of the Venezuelan Social Democratic Party, who was elected and I guess is heading the legislature. Um, those two leaders of constitutional institutions of government are basically rejecting the legitimacy of the other. When sociologists and political scientists describe contention, they may be describing something like this, which we may characterize as a calm before the storm, as supporters of rival factions size each other up. Venezuela's contention may escalate to the point that it breaks out in civil war, or perhaps a social or political revolution may take place. In any event, recognize that a revolution is one thing and contention is a similar thing, but may not be quite, may become a revolution or it may become something else. Um, Eastwood and Dikovic observed that contention often originates out of social movements. They draw a contrast between social movements like the pro-life movement and individual action like public demonstrations or riots, right? Or individual actions, I should say. Movements may resort to tactics like rioting, but a riot is not a movement, right? A riot is maybe symptomatic of some sort of grievance. Social movements require organization and persistence to sustain themselves. Political movements advocating reform and an end to corruption have sprung up in many parts of the developing world. And the use of the internet and social media platforms has acted as a force multiplier. For example, for the citizens of Hong Kong, resisting the encroachments to their autonomy on the part of mainland China. How are social media platforms changing the way that political contention works today, as opposed to previous times? The case in context box on page 285 on Brazil's landless movement again offers another useful insight into kind of distinctions between social movements rather than revolutionary movements. Why did the landless movement begin in Brazil? How was it able to sustain itself? Why isn't Brazil's landless movement considered more of a social revolutionary movement as opposed to simply a movement trying to agitate, more of an interest group, if you would? In order for social movements to survive a contested environment, they have to organize. Organization creates discipline, it harnesses collective action, and it directs mobilization efforts. However, the fact that all movements create organization and over time become institutionalized gives rise to what Robert Michael described as the iron law of oligarchy. What are the implications of Michael's so-called law that collective action always produces new elites? The authors cite a great example to illustrate the complexity of social movements, citing the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s to demonstrate the periods of cooperation and competition among the three moderate African American civil rights groups like the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, versus the more radical organizations like the Nation of Islam and the Black Panther Party. The authors also note the perils of associating social movements with their leadership. Part of the success story behind the Montgomery bus boycott were the grassroots movements and innovations that enabled the African American community to get members of their community to stop using the buses. That was not Martin Luther King. I mean, it may have been his idea, right? But it was the power of collective action, and the effectiveness of that action lay in the fact that the city of Montgomery needed blacks to ride those buses. And their withdrawal of participation hurt the city in measurable ways. And it's also important to keep in mind, victory for the black community was not something that was, it wasn't an ask that the people that the city of Montgomery couldn't provide. They simply had to stop discriminating against blacks. Revolution is the main topic of the chapter, and so let's talk about that for a little bit. First, how can we distinguish between a political and a social revolution? We commonly look at the American Revolution as an example of a political revolution, while the French, Russian, and Chinese revolutions constitute social revolution. What differentiates them? What was going on in France and Russia and China that was not going on in the United States? What are some other examples of more politically oriented revolutions? Another interesting question is, how do we view a coup d'etat? Are they typically political or social revolutions? Another type of revolution are these anti-colonial revolutions, which occurred, kind of massively after World War II. And that refers to the overthrow of a colonial power by a formerly subjugated population. What are the dynamics of third world revolutions that are distinctive from the more, the kinds of revolutions that occurred in the developed world? Think of the forces, sometimes the forces unleashed in those third world revolutions are truly terrifying. Think of what happened when the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia. Their blend of Stalinism and Maoism created an ideology so anti-Western and so kind of homicidal that they killed anyone who showed any vestige of Western affinity, including people that spoke French or wore, eyeglasses. Almost 1/4 of the Cambodian population died of starvation or were executed before the Vietnamese intervened and overthrew the Khmer Rouge in 1979. Scholars of revolution make a distinction between revolutions from above and revolutions from below. Most Americans think of revolutions from below or subaltern revolutions when they use the word revolution. What's a good example of a revolution from above? I'll give you one. And that's in 1918, when the German Imperial Army basically forced Kaiser Wilhelm and his son Prince Maximilian to abdicate, to allow Germany to begin placing its government on a more democratic footing, because they wanted to try and get, more favorable treatment in surrendering to the Triple Entente powers at the end of World War I. In the post-Vietnam War era, revolutionary activity is increasingly taking the form of civil wars, where narrowly supported and frequently corrupt regimes confront subaltern groups, where the correlation of forces is often not decisively on the side of the state. Those kinds of civil wars are always more bloody, and both sides frequently resort to the kinds of violent tactics that meet most definitions of terrorism. Again, the use of violence in those contexts follows the idea of revolution from above or below, with revolutionary dissident groups employing terrorism, dissident terrorism like bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, roadside bombs, and things like that. And regimes employ establishment terrorism in the form of dirty wars, death squads, and secret police interrogations that include, torture. Okay. One of my favorite sections of this chapter is the discussion of everyday resistance, which draws on James C. Scott's classic work entitled Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Form of Peasant Resistance, written in 1985. And he's a great author. He's written a bunch of really good books. Scott notes that peasants are intensely aware that they lack the capacity to directly challenge economic and political elites. And losing the kinds of direct fights that come with challenging those folks is simply not worth it to them. So instead, they engage in subversive forms of resistance, like work stoppages, work slowdowns, sabotage, to protect their political, their traditional rights. In many ways, everyday resistance is a very conservative movement. They're basically saying to elites, you want to do something different, and we don't want that. So the authors ask a good question about everyday resistance. Why wouldn't such people join social movements or revolutions? How do the authors answer that question? I think that's a really good section. A big part of the chapter is devoted to the idea of causes and effects. Why do revolutions happen? One important school of thought is known as relative deprivation, most famously articulated by Ted Robert Gurr in his classic book, Why Men Rebel in 1970. This theory argues that revolutions occur as a result of changes to the status quo. For Gurr in particular, the idea of relative deprivation created frustrations that would cause people to become more revolutionary in nature. So even if a class or a community's status was improving, the perception that their circumstances were not improving fast enough is sufficient to provoke a challenge to the state. Another theory is the idea of resource mobilization. And that is, again, based on the idea that people are always prepared to rebel. It's just that when states break down, that they have the opportunities to act out and rebel. Which of those theories that are listed in this chapter, explaining terror, explaining revolution, do you find most persuasive, and why? One other theory the authors address is the idea of rational choice, which again models successful and unsuccessful revolutions as basically collective action problems. In other words, revolutions succeed when participants overcome free riding and get them to contribute to a revolution, and they fail when prospective rebels fail to secure sufficient participation, or when the state successfully inhibits such participation by euphemistically raising the costs of rebellion. All right, there's a lot of interesting stuff in this chapter, which I lack the space to cover adequately in a mini lecture. Nevertheless, if there's anything that I didn't mention that you think is really fascinating, let's talk about it. And particularly, again, if something is difficult for you to understand, and I didn't mention it, or if I did and you still don't get it, ask a question in the forum, and let's have a great week of discussion.